Okay, so last time we finished the Republic and ended at Book 2. At the end of Book 2, where Socrates is basically Socrates and Adiamantus, but Socrates is really kind of driving things, really leading the conversation. And they basically use reason to decide what the gods must be like. I mean, when I say decide, obviously it's not something arbitrary, but the basic idea there is reason can be used to understand the divine. Reason can be used to understand the gods. They start from the idea that the gods are good and that the gods are, very good, the best possible beings, and they go from there. And Socrates uses reason to say, if we start from this point, what must be true about the gods? Forget about what the tradition tells us. Forget about what Homer or Hesiod tell us. If we start from the idea that the gods are the best beings in existence, or in the best possible condition, and are good and all good, what follows from that according to reason? Now, obviously, you could start from other beginning points and use reason to arrive at different conclusions, and obviously, Socrates doesn't do that. But the key is, again, he uses reason to understand the divine, and in fact, to make fairly radical revisions to traditional Greek religion and so on. This idea that reason can be used to understand the divine carries through into the next two major sections, or the next section of the next two major writings that we'll read. The first deals with a group of Islamic rationalist theologians called the Mu'tazila, and then after that we go on to Aquinas. This reading of this lecture is about the Mu'tazila, and they were a group of rationalist theologians that really kind of were focused in Baghdad, especially around the middle of the 8th century and into the 9th century. First half, especially of the 9th century, so roughly something like 750 to 850 AD or CE, Common Era. And this was basically, there's obviously a lot of things that happened between the time that Socrates was having this conversation in the Republic, sometime in the 5th century Athens, and what was going on then in the early 9th century in Baghdad. So just to summarize that history very briefly, Plato obviously was the author of the Republic. He founded a teaching, a sort of philosophical school that was literally a school that was also used for teaching, called the Academy, and he wrote dialogues that were apparently used in part for teaching purposes in the Academy. And so far as we can tell, all of the dialogues survive. Of course, Plato's famous student was named Aristotle. Aristotle wrote an enormous amount. He also wrote dialogues, but none of them survive. But he also wrote a lot of what we might now think of as more kind of typical philosophy treatises. And whereas Plato, as we see in the Republic, he talks about justice, he talks about founding a city, he talks about theology, he goes on and later talks about what he calls the ideas, what we now might call metaphysics and so on. It all tends to be presented. Many different areas of philosophy are dealt with in individual dialogues altogether, whereas Aristotle wrote what we might think of as more typical philosophy, divided very clearly into different subjects. So, ethics, politics, physics, metaphysics, and so on. And so he wrote a very comprehensive set of philosophical works about almost every aspect of philosophy, of course, he, in many ways, founding what philosophy was and what some of these subject matters were, like metaphysics. He was sort of the first one to sort of really establish that again, it had always been discussed, but Aristotle was the first one to actually identify that and sort of title his work Metaphysics and make that a sort of that is now a major area of philosophy, largely because of Aristotle and because of the way that he divided the different areas of philosophy and so on. So and then after that, of course, you have Alexander the Great. I think he's been the subject of movies recently and so on, who conquered a large part of the world. And when Alexander conquered this, shortly around the time of Aristotle, a little bit afterwards, he basically he didn't just conquer a lot of area. He actually brought Greek civilization with it. So he founded a kind of Hellenistic, but he sort of created the sort of Hellenistic world. This world that had been conquered by Alexander, and therefore Greek culture, including Greek philosophy, spread widely through it. Later, obviously, you had Roman society and Roman culture, which copied a lot from the Greeks, including philosophy. So at this point, still hundreds of years before Christianity, before Jesus lived, and hundreds of years more before Muhammad lived and before Islam emerged as a religion, you had Greek philosophy and then Roman philosophy spread throughout much of this area, spread throughout what is now what we call the Middle East or the Near East. So it was no longer just in Athens or just in Greece. It had now spread very widely. And so, of course, in time, again, there was Alexander and his empire, and then the Romans came, and then eventually the Romans collapsed. Again, we're going to cover a lot of history here very briefly and quickly. And Europe went into what's often called the Dark Ages, in part because it was a time of in part because we just don't have very much information about it, because it was a time of sort of civilizational collapse. I mean, that might be a little too dramatic, but things were very unsettled. The Roman Empire had been destroyed. There was, civilization was not very highly built up, and meanwhile, obviously, in the Arabian Peninsula, what you had around the 600, 610, 620, again, Common Era. This is basically Muhammad emerged and emerged as a prophet, and after he died, various people succeeded him, and almost immediately this religion that he founded exploded and conquered a huge part of the known world. And obviously Muhammad, was a prophet. He had a revelation, a scripture, the Quran, of course, and this became the basis for this. I mean, along with other things like the Hadith, the reports of things that Muhammad did and said. But the Quran especially became the revelation, the sort of real foundation for the Islamic religion. And as it spread, this religion came out of Arabia, out of the Arabian Peninsula, which was a relatively undeveloped area compared to some of the areas that it conquered in terms of philosophy. So you have this revelation that immediately runs up against these very developed, very sophisticated cultures that have centuries of philosophical tradition and debate behind them and so on. And in contrast to Christianity, when it does this, when it meets these things, it meets them again. Islam, the religion, the Quran, all of this meets these much more these sort of older, again, more philosophically developed societies and cultures. It meets them as the basis for political rule. So a lot of these things that then had to be puzzled out by the Mu'tazila, which we'll talk about, were puzzled out in the context of who has the right to rule. Because again, we won't get into all of the history here, but Muhammad died, and there were four, what are usually called the four rightly guided caliphs, who came after him, who were all personally associated with him. After the last of them died, Ali, that began a split in Islam, which continues today between Sunni and Shia. But also then that created questions, well, who rules and on what basis, and what does it mean to rule, and what does it mean to rule well as an Islamic ruler, as a Muslim ruler? And so all of these questions that emerge about how do we understand the revelation, how do we understand the Quran, how do we understand some of these passages that seem to maybe contradict other passages, all of this was being figured out again in this very quick confrontation with a very developed ancient, but again, centuries old philosophical tradition. And it was done in the context of very pressing questions about who would rule as well. And the reading that we use, from Majid Fakhri's History of Islamic Philosophy, talks about that, talks about how something that may seem like a very abstract question, do people have free will, was in fact very hotly contested and even dangerous because, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but basically it had very clear political implications, okay? So again, that's sort of very, very obviously incomplete and very quick and partial summary of what happens between Plato and Socrates and the Mu'tazila. But again, the Mu'tazila it was a group. So the Mu'tazila, it's a group of people. It's like saying the rationalists or the empiricists or the idealists or something. It's the Stoics or something. It's a group of rationalist theologians who again were mainly focused in Baghdad around especially sort of the early 9th century, so AD or Common Era. So roughly something like 800 to 850 was when they really were at their peak, and basically two particular doctrines or teachings are really associated with them: the idea of divine justice and the idea of divine unity. Divine unity is much more abstract. It was dealt with more in the second part of the reading, but we'll talk about it briefly here. Divine unity, they were very concerned about the idea of what is the relationship between God's essence and God's attributes. So obviously they're in an Islamic context. They believe in God, and they're saying, well, how do we understand God though? And in particular, what is the difference between an essence and an attribute? The idea of an essence is what is sort of part of the essence of something. So to jump ahead a little bit, to use one of Aquinas' examples, it is part of the essence of a human being to be an animal. All human beings are animals. We're born, we're generated through physical means, we have physical bodies, we have all the same animal passions and so on. So obviously Aquinas will say we're not only animals, we have reason as well, but part of the essence of a human being is to be an animal. But other things, tall or short, wise or foolish, courageous or cowardly, these are attributes. not all human beings are wise, not all human beings are cowardly, not all human beings are tall or short, not all human beings are fat or skinny. These are attributes that are not part of the essence, so they're somehow separate from the essence. If you think of a rose, whatever the essence of a rose is, it's not to be red, because there are white roses as well. So the color of a rose is an attribute somehow distinct from its essence. Again, you can think of a dog. Part of the essence of a dog is to have 4 legs, but again, the color of a dog, there are black dogs, white dogs, spotted dogs. Clearly, a particular color is not part of the essence. The color is an attribute. And obviously, when people talk about God, they almost always say God has attributes. They're not necessarily thinking of it in this way. Well, here I'm talking about an attribute of God, but they say God is just, God is wise, God is all-powerful. These are clearly attributes. And the Mu'tazila were very concerned with the idea that if you talk about God having attributes, then you're somehow separating, you're somehow dividing God between God's essence and God's attributes. Especially if you say God is eternal. So therefore, God's justice has always existed. God's wisdom has always existed. That if you say that these attributes are somehow different from the essence of God, then you're actually coming dangerously close to polytheism, to the idea that there are multiple divinities, because there's God, the essence of God, and then there are the different divine attributes: justice, wisdom, power, etc. So they were very concerned with explaining, and the reading talks about some of the different strategies that they used, or some of the different arguments that they used, how to understand God's attributes as not separate from His essence. But the key here to focus on for this lecture is just to say, again, that the idea was that they didn't want the attributes to be separate from the essence, because then that would seem like polytheism. Then you're somehow violating the unity of God. And obviously you can see how that makes sense. I mean, if God's justice is somehow separate from His essence, then you kind of are talking about two different things. And if they're both eternal, and part of what defines God is that God is the only thing that's eternal, well, but then He's not the only thing that's eternal. God's justice is also eternal. So you're sort of talking about two different things. So the key here obviously is one of the basic beliefs of the Mu'tazila, that God can be understood rationally. The divine can be understood using human reason. And this is an example of that, using human reason to understand what is the relationship between God and God's attributes. And as the reading talks about, this included the Quran, one of the great debates in Islamic theology. At this time, was the Quran created, or is it eternal? Has it always existed along with God? Was it created? Again, a very controversial question. The Mu'tazila, again, said it was created. If you say it's eternal, clearly God's speech is somehow different from God. So if you say it's eternal, then you're saying that, again, there's something else that's co-eternal with God, and that doesn't really look like divine unity. But again, without getting into all the details which are covered in the reading about the different arguments that are used, again, the key is the Mu'tazila said God can be understood using human reason. Human reason can help us understand what the divine is, and can help us make sense of our beliefs about the divine. Okay, so the idea of divine unity is one example, and again, a fairly abstract example. God's justice is the other major example. And again, this is what actually most of the reading is really about, and it's sort of, again, in many ways is much more dramatic, because the argument, first of all, whether or not the argument for divine justice, the Mu'tazila argument for divine justice, is closely connected to the argument about whether or not human beings have free will. And as the reading explains, this was a very controversial, even deadly debate that you might think, well, what could be more abstract? There are obviously debates that are more abstract than whether or not people have free will, but you might think, whether or not people have free will, that's a fairly abstract philosophical question. How can that ever be a dangerous thing to have an opinion on? But as the reading explains, part of the idea was, well, if people don't have free will, then the actions of the caliph, as the rulers, then the action of the ruler is not his own action, it's the action of God. So if you oppose the action of the ruler, you're not opposing the action of a human being who is ruling, perhaps unjustly. You're opposing the action of God Himself, who's the one who's actually controlling the action of the ruler. So again, if human beings don't have free will, then the actions of the ruler are simply the will of God. And if you oppose the ruler, then you're actually opposing the will of God, and so you can't do that. Now, obviously, if you think about it, well, the people who are opposing the ruler are also just doing the will of God. I mean, if they don't have free choice either, they don't have free will. So if they're choosing to oppose, if they're actually acting against the ruler, it's not because they're choosing it. So you can't really blame them for that either. I mean, but obviously the idea here was not to have a consistent or coherent or compelling view of free will. The idea was, this is obviously a very politically useful idea. If people believe that the actions of the ruler are actually just the actions of God, if people believe that what the rulers do is simply the will of God, and therefore they shouldn't resist, that's obviously politically useful. So arguing that people do in fact have free will, which is what the Mu'tazila did, was a very big threat to the rulers and a dangerous thing to do. So why did they do it? What was their argument? And a lot of it comes down again to the idea of divine justice. And again, so what you have is that the Quran comes out, revealed by Muhammad, and sort of Islam emerges very quickly, very suddenly, takes over a huge part of the known world, or a huge part of the world in that area, and becomes the basis for really a whole civilization, a whole obviously a religion, but also now a legal system, and again a whole civilization and society, and so but of course there are different parts of it. How do we understand these different parts then? If this is the Word of God, what do we do with these seeming contradictions, or at least tensions between different parts of the text? So there are different things that the Quran says about God. Obviously that God is all powerful. And this was the argument against free will. The argument against free will said that God is all powerful. The Quran says this very clearly. But if God is all powerful, then that means human beings cannot be the author or the cause of their own actions. If I have free will, and if I do something even very trivial like pick up this pen, if I chose to do that rather than God making me do it, then that limits the power of God. I was the cause of that action. God wasn't. If I choose what to have for dinner, if I'm the one making that choice, then God isn't. Then it limits the power of God, because I'm the cause of certain events in the world. Picking up a pen, eating something for dinner. If I'm the cause of that, though, then the argument was that limits the power of God. And the Quran says that God is all powerful. Therefore, human beings must not have free will, because again, if they had free will, then that would limit God's power. The Mu'tazila came back and said, yeah, but the Quran also says that God is just, and it also says that God is punishing the wicked in hell. And so they said, look, if God is just, and if God is punishing the wicked, then human beings must have free will. Because if God is making people do their actions, if the actions of human beings are actually just caused by God, and they have no free will at all, no choice over what they actually do, and so some of them are doing wicked things and sinning and so on, not because they're choosing that themselves, but because God is making them do it, and then he's turning around and punishing them for something that he made them do, then the Mu'tazila said, well, that's not just. That's obviously not just. It can't be just to punish somebody for something that they had no control over. Reason tells us that. Reason tells us that in a very fundamental way. Okay, so again, just to sort of clarify what they're saying or repeat it, if I go out and I won't do this, but if I go out and kill somebody, and it's because I chose to do it, and then I kill somebody, and then I'm driving home and I get in a car wreck and die, and let's say that all of this is true, and I go to be judged by God, and God says, well, you killed somebody and you chose to do that, therefore you go to hell. If I go out and kill somebody and then I die, and I go and I'm being judged, and God says, well, you killed somebody. And I said, yeah, but I didn't choose that. You made me do that. And God said, well, it's too bad. You're going to be punished for it anyways. I mean, that doesn't make sense. I mean, that's obviously not just. It's not just to punish somebody for something they had no control over, and it's especially not just to punish somebody for something that you made them do, which is what this argument was, that God is, if people don't have free will, but God is punishing the wicked, but God is the cause of their wickedness. How is that fair? How is that reasonable? So so the Mu'tazila said, look, reason tells us certain things, not just about God, but about justice. And in a very, very fundamental way, reason tells us that it is not just to punish people for things that they didn't choose to do themselves, for things that they had no control over. So for instance, you might people obviously debate all kinds of questions of, we think of the Republic. What exactly is justice? People debate back and forth. So reason doesn't necessarily establish everything about justice. But one of the basic, again, to borrow a term from Aquinas, what we might say is self-evident reason. Something that reason simply accepts when it sees it. It can't necessarily, explain why, but it's just self-evident. It's just obvious. Something that reason tells us is simply self-evident. Something so fundamental that reason can't really question it. And that's what the Mu'tazila are saying about the idea of punishment. It's just self-evident to human reason that it's unjust to punish somebody for something that they didn't have any control over, that they didn't choose to do. It's only just to punish people if they're choosing their actions, and therefore in some sense they can meaningfully be held to be responsible for them. So the Mu'tazila said, reason tells us not just things about God, but things about justice as well. And if reason tells us something in a very fundamental way, if reason tells us clearly, unequivocally, that it's unjust to punish people for things that they didn't choose to do, And if our religion says God is just and also says that God is punishing people, then human beings must have free will, because the only way for God to punish people and for him to be doing it justly is if human beings have free will. So, the argument against free will rested on this part of this obviously very important part of the Quran. Undeniably, it's there that God is all-powerful, but then the Mu'tazila said, yes, but more important is that God is just. And so God's justice isn't just a synonym for his power. It actually means something. It actually has a real content. Saying that God is just means something, and it means something that we can understand. It does. Again, it's not just an honorific that's applied to God just because it sounds good and it's something else. Mu'tazila said when the Quran says God is just, it's saying something that we can understand. We understand something about what justice is. Again, human reason doesn't tell us everything. People debate certain fine, or not even fine points. People debate some fairly important things about justice. But no one is arguing that it's somehow reasonable to punish people for things they had no control over, that they didn't choose to do. So they're saying, again, that if the Quran says that God is just, then that must mean that human beings have free will. If God is punishing them, again, that's the other possibility. Maybe God is just, but human beings don't have free will. But maybe there's no afterlife, so nobody's punished, or maybe if there's no punishment at all, then God could still be just and people could not have free will. But once you start saying that God is punishing the wicked, then again, it's only just, it's only reasonable for God to punish the wicked if they chose their wickedness themselves, and we're not compelled to do it by the will of God. A particular quote from the Fakhri reading that is especially really explains this well. So Fakhri writes, especially significant in this regard was their contention, the Mu'tazila contention, that good and evil are not conventional or arbitrary concepts whose validity is rooted in the dictates of God. So in other words, their contention that good and evil, the ideas of what's good and what's evil, are not conventional or arbitrary concepts, are not just kind of meaningless concepts, conventional, they have an arbitrary meaning, they simply mean whatever God says they mean, or whatever the representatives of God say that they mean, whatever these theologians say, because obviously God wasn't talking to anybody at this point. It was a question of interpreting the Quran. And so again, the Mu'tazila was saying, look, good and evil, these aren't just conventional or arbitrary concepts whose validity are simply rooted in the dictates of God or in God's command, as the traditionists and later the Ash'arites held. And again, this is Fakhri writing this, explaining this, but are rational categories which can be established through unaided reason. So again, good and bad, just and unjust, these are rational categories that can be established through unaided reason. So again, unaided human reason can tell us what is good and bad. Maybe not completely, but in some very fundamental ways it can. It can tell us what's just and unjust. And so therefore, these things tell us what God must be like. If God is just and reason tells us it's only just to punish people if they're choosing it, then human beings must have free will. You could think of it as basically they're arguing that God must conform to what reason tells us about justice. But of course, they might argue, well, it's not that God has to conform, it's just that reason tells us real things about the world. That reason tells us real things about justice and therefore about God if God is just. So basically, again, the Mu'tazila, like Socrates, held, reason tells us things about God. Reason can help us understand our belief about God, both in terms of how to understand, well, if God has attributes, if God is wise and just and so on, what does it mean for him to have attributes and to be eternal and to be God and to be, one God only and to have this divine unity. Reason can help us understand what we believe by saying all of those things, by thinking about what the relationship between God's essence and God's attributes must be. And also, again, more fundamentally, maybe not more fundamentally, but what we're focusing on here, reason tells us what justice is. Again, not completely. There's some disagreement, but on certain very fundamental points, like whether or not it's just to punish somebody for something they didn't choose to do and had no control over, on very fundamental things like that, reason tells us something very real about what justice is, and therefore it tells us something about what God is like if God is just. So they're not quite as radical as Socrates, who's simply throwing out big parts of the Greek tradition. Hesiod and Homer were sort of, they really weren't like the Greek Quran, because there really wasn't a Greek version of the Quran or the Bible or something like that. That type of book with that type of authority and so on didn't really exist in ancient Greece, but Homer was something like that. And Socrates said, we just have to get rid of it. The part where he says Zeus gives good and bad to people, we just can't say that, because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't follow from the idea that the gods are all good, that they would somehow produce bad. The Mu'tazila aren't going that far. They're obviously not saying, well, we need to simply revise the Quran. That wasn't really much of an option. But again, in a very important way, they are saying that reason can tell us certain things about how to understand the Quran, and reason can revise very powerful religious beliefs, such as that above all God is powerful. And again, the Mu'tazila said no, above all God is just, and therefore, however we understand the idea that God is all powerful, it has to be in accord with what we know justice to be. And then again, the reading kind of gives examples of how they tried to sort of figure that out, how they tried to explain how human beings could have free will, and not actually limit the power of God. But again, the crucial point here, the Mu'tazila said, reason can tell us things about God, and in particular, again, what reason tells us about justice, that tells us something about God. What reason tells us about justice, God is just in that way. And so